Hey guys, tonight we're boarding a plane. Not a modern one with the little pretzel bags and the passive-aggressive armrest negotiations. I mean a 1950s American commercial flight. Back when flying wasn't just transportation, it was an event. A full costume, 4-course meal, champagne at 30,000 feet event. When air travel was so glamorous, so outrageously over the top, and, as it turns out, so quietly insane that you'll wonder how anyone survived it with their eardrums, their dignity, or their blood alcohol level intact. Before we taxi down the runway, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And a massive, genuine thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. You know who you are, and I want you to know that your suggestion made it all the way into the recording booth, which is more than most ideas accomplish in a lifetime. Comments like yours are genuinely what shapes this channel, so leave one below, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And if you're catching this on Spotify, welcome, the link is in the description. Now, dim those lights, pull the blanket up, maybe switch on a fan for that soft droning white noise, something that sounds, if you squint your ears, vaguely like a propeller. Get comfortable, because we're about to spend a few thousand miles together. But first, have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to fly in the 1950s? Was it really as glamorous as the old photographs make it look? Did people genuinely dress in their absolute best just to sit in a metal tube for 6 hours? What did the food taste like? And more importantly, how was anyone expected to eat a 3-course meal while experiencing moderate turbulence over Ohio? Could you smoke on the plane? Could you smoke everywhere on the plane? Was the pilot actually that calm, or was he quietly terrified and just very good at hats? Would you have been able to afford a ticket in the first place? And if so, what exactly were you expected to wear, say, and not say once you were on board? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1955. You're standing in a terminal that smells like cigarette smoke, floor wax and ambition. Your suit is pressed, your hat is on, and somewhere out on the tarmac, a propeller-driven machine is being loaded with your luggage. Your dinner and your complete misplaced confidence that this is all going to go absolutely fine. Let's talk about money. Specifically, the kind of money that flying required in the 1950s, which was the kind of money that made you sit down at the kitchen table, get out a notepad, do some arithmetic, stare at the arithmetic, and then do it again in case you'd made an error the first time. A one-way ticket from New York to Los Angeles in the mid-50s cost somewhere around $150. That sounds almost reasonable until you convert it to today's money, at which point it becomes approximately $1,700, and suddenly the notepad makes a lot more sense. Flying was not casual. Flying was not something you did because the train was inconvenient or the drive seemed long. And flying was a financial commitment that sat in roughly the same category as buying a refrigerator or getting a tooth crowned, something you planned for, justified carefully, and mentioned to people afterward because you had earned the right to mention it. The passengers who filled those cabins were, by modern standards, an extraordinarily narrow slice of the population. Business executives who needed to be in Chicago by Tuesday, and had companies willing to pay for the privilege. Wealthy families relocating or visiting or simply demonstrating that they were the kind of family that relocated and visited by air. The occasional celebrity, which we'll get to later. Government officials, foreign dignitaries, and then, occasionally, the person who had saved for months and was doing this once for a specific reason, a wedding, a funeral, no once-in-a-lifetime trip, and who had told everyone about it in advance, and was now fully committed to getting their money's worth in every possible sense. The airlines understood exactly who their customers were and priced accordingly. This wasn't gouging, it was economics. Operating a propeller aircraft across the country was expensive. Fuel, crew, maintenance, the 3-course meal, the cloth napkins, the woman pouring the gin, all of it cost money, and that cost was reflected in the ticket price with zero apology. The airlines weren't trying to make flying accessible, They were trying to make flying aspirational, and a ticket price that gave you pause was part of the product. You were not paying to be transported. You were paying to belong briefly to a class of people for whom being transported by air was normal. The class system within the aircraft was also, by modern budget carrier standards, something from a different civilization entirely. First class existed, and it was genuinely, substantively different from coach, more space, better food, more attentive service. The reasonable expectation that the person beside you was also in first class for a reason, and would comport themselves accordingly. Coach, meanwhile, was still coach in only the relative sense. Compared to first class on the same aircraft, it was modest. Compared to any seat on any modern low-cost carrier, it was a spa. And here is the thing that nobody in the 1950s found strange, but which, viewed from the present, is genuinely disorienting. There were no sales, no flash deals, no Tuesday afternoon promotional fares, no loyalty points, no algorithm deciding your seat price based on when you searched and what browser you used and whether it detected mild desperation in your click patterns. The price was the price. It was printed in a tariff booklet and approved by a federal regulatory body, and it was the same for every passenger on every airline, because price competition between carriers was, by law, not permitted. What this meant in practice was that airlines competed on everything, except the one thing that most modern travellers care about most. They competed on food, on service, on glamour, on the sheer theatrical quality of the experience. And if you could afford the ticket, the experience they delivered was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. If you couldn't, you took the train, and the train was also fine, and this was just the way of things. And nobody was particularly anguished about it. The world had not yet decided that flying was a right. In the 1950s, flying was a privilege, and it dressed accordingly. Before you so much as looked at a departure board in 1955, you went through a process of physical preparation that most modern travellers reserve for weddings or court appearances. Men wore suits, full suits, not the soft, unstructured, I could almost wear this to a barbecue suit that passes in contemporary business casual, but a proper structured suit with a pressed shirt and a knotted tie, and shoes that had been polished either that morning or recently enough that the difference wasn't visible. You wore a hat because men wore hats, and you tipped it at nothing in particular because that was simply what hats were for. You carried a briefcase or a proper leather bag. You did not carry a backpack with a hip belt and a carabiner clipped to the zipper for no evident reason. You looked like a person who had made deliberate choices about their appearance, because you had, because everyone had, because showing up to an airport in the 1950s in anything less than your considered best was a social statement nobody wanted to make. Women had it, if anything, more precisely specified. A dress or a smart skirt suit, never trousers, which were still navigating their way into mainstream women's travel wear. Gloves, if you were flying anywhere that counted as a significant occasion, which flying always did. Heels that were neither comfortable nor practical but were entirely load-bearing in terms of the overall impression you were constructing. Hair done, lipstick applied. A handbag that matched something. The complete effect was of a person who understood that being seen in an airport was being seen, full stop, and that being seen required preparation. This was not vanity in the pejorative sense. It was a social contract. Everyone around you had also dressed carefully, and the collective result was a departure lounge that looked less like a waiting room and more like the lobby of a very good hotel. Well-dressed people moving with purpose, carrying themselves with the self-consciousness of people who knew they were in a public space that had a certain character and who had decided to match it. The aircraft cabin had the same quality. You sat down in your seats surrounded by people who looked like they'd made an effort, and this produced entirely by accident the atmosphere of an occasion, which flying was. That was the whole point. The interesting thing is that nobody was told to dress this way. There was no dress code posted at the ticket counter. No airline employee turned anyone away for their wardrobe choices. The standard was entirely social and entirely enforced, not by rules, but by the shared understanding of what was appropriate, which in the 1950s was a technology far more effective than any written policy. You dressed for the flight the way you dressed for church or a dinner party or a job interview, because context demanded it, and because failing to read context was the kind of thing that people noticed and quietly filed away. The transition from this world to the one we currently inhabit, in which a significant portion of air travellers board in what appears to be their pyjamas, often did not happen overnight. It happened gradually through the 1960s and 70s, as flying became more accessible, more routine, and less theatrical. As the price came down and the volume went up, the social contract quietly dissolved. Nobody decided that sweatpants on a plane were acceptable. It's just that the counter-argument that flying is an event requiring your best self slowly stopped being something enough people believed. Flying became transit. And transit, as a category, doesn't require heels. But standing in a 1955 departure lounge, watching the well-dressed crowd move toward the gate with their leather bags and their confident hats, the idea that this would ever be otherwise would have seemed not just unlikely but genuinely incomprehensible. Why would you dress any other way for something like this? Walking into an American airport terminal in the 1950s felt less like entering a transportation hub and more like stepping into a very optimistic vision of the future, one in which everything was glass and chrome and possibility, and everyone looked like they were headed somewhere important, because they were. The terminals were small by any contemporary standard. There were no labyrinthine concourses stretching to the horizon. There were no moving walkways carrying blank-faced passengers past a sequence of chain restaurants and sunglasses kiosks. There was a building, a relatively modest and often architecturally interesting building, and within it there was a departure hall, and beyond that there was a gate, and beyond that there was the tarmac. And the whole geography of getting from the entrance to the aircraft could be covered in a walk of minutes, rather than the navigational commitment that modern air travel requires. What the terminals lacked in scale, they more than compensated for in atmosphere. The lounges had real furniture, cushioned chairs and sofas arranged in conversational groupings, as if the designers had imagined the waiting passengers as guests rather than a crowd to be managed. There were bars with bar stools and human bartenders and drinks served in actual glasses. There were restaurants with linen tablecloths where you could sit down to a meal and watch aircraft taxi past the window. And nobody thought this was remarkable because in this context it wasn't. It was just what airports were. The whole physical environment operated on the assumption that the people using it were worth designing for, which produced spaces that felt genuinely hospitable rather than merely functional. The newsstand sold newspapers and magazines and cigarettes, and the kind of paperback novels that were clearly written for long journeys and made no apology about it. There were florists occasionally. There were gift shops selling the specific category of items, small, portable, emblematic of the city you were leaving, that airports have always sold and always will. There were shoe-shine stands staffed by men who were very good at their job and who could look at your shoes and give you an honest assessment in approximately 4 seconds. The whole commercial ecology of the terminal was human-scaled and human-staffed, because the 1950s had not yet developed the technology to replace human beings with screens, and this was, it turns out, mostly fine. The light in those terminals was different too. The great mid-century airports, Idlewild in New York, Midway in Chicago, Love Field in Dallas, were designed by architects who understood what natural light did to a space and who used it accordingly. High ceilings, generous windows, the specific quality of afternoon sun coming through glass and landing on a terrazzo floor in a way that made even waiting feel like something other than lost time. You could sit in those chairs with your newspaper and your coffee and your cigarette and look out at the airfield and feel, in a way that's difficult to articulate but immediately recognizable to anyone who's experienced it, that you were in the right place at the right time doing the right thing. The scale of the crowds was part of it. In 1955, the total number of domestic airline passengers in the United States for the entire year was around 40 million. Today, that number passes through American airports in approximately 2 weeks. The terminal you stood in was shared with a manageable number of well-dressed people who were all, for their own various reasons, also engaged in the specific social theatre of air travel. You could hear individual conversations. You could make eye contact with a stranger without it being alarming. You could exist in the space with some individual dignity, rather than as one unit in a vast shuffling organism trying to find gate C47 before the zone boarding announcement. It was, by every sensible measure, a more pleasant way to travel. That was also more expensive, more exclusive and available to a fraction of the population it serves today, is the complicated footnote that the nostalgia tends to leave out. But standing in it, surrounded by the chrome and the light and the people in their good clothes, it felt like the future, the correct future, the one we were supposed to get. There were no self-check-in kiosks, no apps, no QR codes scanned by a bored employee who makes brief eye contact before waving you through. In the 1950s, checking in for a flight was a face-to-face transaction conducted at a long, wooden or formica counter by a human being who had been trained, dressed, and groomed specifically for this moment, and who was performing their part of the airport theatre with the seriousness it deserved. The airline agent, almost always a man in a sharply pressed uniform with an airline logo on the breast pocket, and a manner that communicated both authority and helpfulness, would locate your paper ticket, verify your name against a physical manifest, and issue you a boarding pass that had been hand-stamped with the kind of mechanical satisfaction that only exists in a world before touchscreens. Your ticket was a physical object, not a printout, not a PDF on your phone, but a proper booklet of thin cardstock, multi-part, with carbon paper between the sections and your name typed on it by someone who had used an actual typewriter for this purpose. It detailed your flight number, your departure time, your seat assignment. If seat assignments had been made, which wasn't always the case on shorter routes, and your airline. Rendered in the specific font and colour scheme that was that airline's entire personality, compressed onto a small rectangle of card. You kept this ticket with some care, because losing it was a problem that could not be solved by asking the airline to resend it to your email address. The check-in process itself was unhurried in a way that would cause modern travellers physical distress. The agent reviewed your ticket. He looked at the manifest. He looked at you. He may have asked you a question or two, your destination, confirming your name, the standard small courtesies of a transaction between two people who were both present for it. Your luggage was weighed on a scale that was right there in front of you. No mystery, no theatre, and tagged with a small cardboard label tied around the handle, bearing your name and destination in handwriting or typewritten text. The luggage then disappeared behind the counter to begin its own separate journey to the aircraft hold, a journey whose reliability you simply trusted without any means of tracking it, because tracking was not yet a concept available to checked baggage. The weight limit was enforced with the mild authority of someone who was going to enforce it, but wasn't going to enjoy the conversation. Overweight baggage could be checked for an additional fee, the amount of which was calculated by the agent with a small chart and some arithmetic, performed in front of you with a pencil, which was either reassuring or alarming depending on how you felt about mental arithmetic conducted on behalf of your travel costs. There was no outrage about this. The fee was reasonable. The agent was polite. You paid it, or you opened your suitcase on the counter and redistributed weight between bags, with the particular focus of someone who had made a miscalculation and was correcting it in public with maximum efficiency. What's worth pausing on is the quality of attention. The agent behind that counter was the airline in every meaningful sense. Its face, its voice, its response to your specific situation. If something was wrong with your booking, he fixed it. Right there. With a pen. In front of you. There was no escalation path. There was no chatbot. There was no hold music. And then a different agent in a different city who also couldn't help you but was very sorry about it. There was a person with a pen and the authority to solve the problem, and in most cases the problem was solved. And you moved on toward the lounge and your complimentary cigarette and the general forward momentum of your journey. It was slower than what replaced it, and better in almost every way that's difficult to quantify, which is the category of things we're always discovering too late. If you had time before your flight, and you almost always did, because the concept of arriving 45 minutes early and calling it fine had not yet been normalised, you sat in the terminal lounge and you behaved like a person of considered leisure. Not because you were required to, but because the lounge had been designed for exactly this, and because the alternative, standing near the gate looking at your watch, was the kind of thing that suggested you hadn't quite mastered the art of travel. And in the 1950s, mastering the art of travel was part of the whole project. The lounge was furnished and staffed with the understanding that waiting, done properly, did not have to feel like waiting. There were seats that were comfortable without being soporific. There was a bar, an actual bar, with a bartender and a rail, and spirits arranged behind it with the professional neatness of someone who took the presentation of alcohol seriously. You could order a scotch at 10 in the morning without anyone raising an eyebrow because your flight was in 2 hours and it was 10 in the morning somewhere that mattered to you, and the bartender understood this implicitly. There was coffee, which was the kind of coffee that 1950s America produced in large quantities and served with confidence, and which was, by modern specialty roaster standards, perfectly fine and not worth discussing further. You smoked. Of course you smoked. There were ashtrays on every available surface, built into the armrests of the lounge chairs, freestanding beside the bar on the small side tables between seats. The ambient condition of the lounge was a light, sociable haze of tobacco that nobody experienced as unpleasant because it was simply the atmosphere, like humidity in Florida or altitude in Denver, a condition of the place you were in, accepted without remark. The specific blend of cigarette smoke, coffee, and whatever was happening in the adjacent restaurant created the olfactory identity of the mid-century airport lounge, which was, if you'd grown up with it, the smell of departure, of possibility, of things about to happen. People talk to each other. This requires emphasis because it is, from the present vantage point, almost anthropologically remarkable. Strangers in the waiting lounge of a 1955 airport engaged in genuine, extended, mutually interested conversation with other strangers, without apparent anxiety, without the buffer of a phone screen, without the modern traveller's default posture of visible unavailability. You might spend 40 minutes talking to a man you'd never met about where he was going and what he did, and whether he thought the Dodgers were going to do anything useful this season. You might meet a woman who turned out to be travelling to the same city for a wedding 3 blocks from where you were staying, and you'd spend the rest of the wait swapping mutual acquaintances with a casual delight of discovering that the world was smaller than it seemed. This was not unusual. It was just what people did when they were waiting in a room together, and none of them had a small computer in their pocket demanding their attention every 45 seconds. The lounge was, in its quiet way, one of the social institutions of its moment, a place where the American middle and upper class briefly circulated, mixed, and performed the version of themselves that they brought to public spaces where appearances mattered. You were on display, gently, and you responded to being on display the way people in that era responded to most things that required a public self. With composure, good manners, and the specific ease of someone who had dressed appropriately, and therefore had nothing to worry about. The flight itself hadn't started yet, but in the lounge the journey had already begun. She was young. She was. By federal regulation and airline policy, unmarried, marriage was a fireable offence at most American carriers until the 1970s, enforced with a directness that today reads as breathtaking, and at the time was simply the terms of employment that applicants accepted or did not accept. She was within a specific weight range, checked at regular intervals with a scale and a clipboard, and she was between 20 and 26 years old, above which she was considered, by the operational logic of the carriers, to have aged out of the role in some way that nobody was ever entirely specific about, but everyone clearly agreed upon. She was, in the language of her era, pleasant-looking, a qualification so vague and so loaded that it said everything and nothing simultaneously. She had trained for this, not in the casual, orientation video sense, but in a genuine residential multi-week program that covered emergency evacuation procedures, first aid, meteorology, meal service protocols, and the mechanics of a pleasant interaction in a pressurized metal cylinder with a stranger who was either drunk, frightened, motion sick, or some combination of all three. She knew the aircraft's emergency exits by feel. She knew how to administer oxygen and how to manage a medical situation at altitude and how to make the person experiencing that medical situation feel calm while she managed it, which was the harder of the two skills. She could do all of this while walking down an aircraft aisle in heels during moderate turbulence without spilling your drink, which is a physical achievement that deserves significantly more recognition than it has historically received. The uniform was a collaboration between fashion and function that leaned heavily toward fashion. It had been designed by an actual fashion designer, in many cases, because airlines hired fashion designers for this purpose, to convey modernity, femininity, and the specific brand personality of the airline, all simultaneously. TWA's stewardesses wore different uniforms than Americans, which wore different uniforms than Pan Am's, which wore different uniforms than United's, and each set of uniforms communicated something slightly different about what kind of airline you were on and what kind of experience you were supposed to be having. The hat, which was part of every uniform, was non-negotiable. The hat was everything. The social position occupied by the stewardess in 1950s, America was genuinely peculiar. She was, in the eyes of the culture, glamorous, featured in advertising, visible in magazines, the human face of the technological wonder of aviation. Young women applied in large numbers and were rejected in large numbers, and considered the job, if they got it, to be one of the most desirable available to them, offering travel, independence, a salary, and a uniform that attracted attention of various kinds. Simultaneously, the job was defined by restrictions on weight, on age, on marital status. That would be illegal today, and that reflected a view of women as decorative elements of a service environment rather than professionals in a career. She was, in short, both more and less than she appeared, more competent, more trained, more capable of managing a genuine emergency than any passenger looking at her well-ironed uniform and practiced smile would have guessed, and less free, less permanent, less in control of her own employment than the confidence she projected suggested. She navigated this gap every single working day, and she navigated it with a grace that the airlines took for granted and that the history books have mostly forgotten. The martini she placed on your tray table with a smile was the visible part. Everything else was invisible, as she had been trained for it to be. The aircraft you were about to board was, by any honest measure, a masterpiece of 1950s engineering, which is to say, it was extraordinary and extremely loud, and vibrated in a way that the human body spends the first 20 minutes adjusting to, and the following hours accepting as the new normal. The dominant workhorses of American commercial aviation in the mid-50s were propeller aircraft, and they were magnificent in the specific way that very powerful machines are magnificent. Not elegant in the passive, effortless sense, but muscular and purposeful and very present in a way that reminded you constantly that you were riding inside them. The Douglas DC-6 was the workhorse, reliable, four-engined, unpretentious in the way that a tool that does its job extremely well doesn't need to be. The Lockheed Constellation was the showpiece, a triple-tailed, dolphin-shaped aircraft with a fuselage that curved gracefully from nose to tail, and a silhouette so distinctive that you could identify it in the sky from a mile away. Howard Hughes had championed its development at TWA, and it became the aircraft most associated with the glamour of 50s aviation, the one that appeared in the magazine advertisements with the sunset behind it, and the headline promising something lyrical about the skies. It was also, operationally, somewhat more complicated than its competitors, and required maintenance attention that its beauty perhaps justified, and perhaps didn't, depending on who you asked, and whether they were a passenger or a mechanic. The Boeing Stratocruiser was something else entirely. If the DC-6 was a very good car and the Constellation was a sports car, the Stratocruiser was a yacht. Derived from the B-29 bomber's fuselage design, it was enormous, a double-deck aircraft with a main cabin above and a cocktail lounge below, accessible by a spiral staircase during flight. Mid-flight spiral staircase, on an airplane, in 1953. The lounge seated about 14 people on cushioned stools around a curved bar, and passengers would descend to it mid-journey, with the casual confidence of people visiting the downstairs of a building that happened to be at 20,000 feet. It was the most luxurious aircraft in domestic service, and it was used primarily by airlines who wanted their passengers to have a story to tell when they landed. The engines were the thing, 4 of them, one under each wing, now each one a large radial piston engine producing a sound and a vibration that began the moment they turned over on the ground, and didn't stop until the wheels touched down at the other end. The sound was not the clean, receding roar of a modern jet engine. It was a constant physical surrounding presence, a deep cyclical throb that transmitted through the fuselage and the floor and the seat, and the armrests and eventually through you, until you stopped noticing it, the way you stopped noticing the refrigerator hum at 3 a.m, not because it's gone, but because you've absorbed it into your experience of being alive. Passengers read through it, ate through it, slept through it somehow, had long and intimate conversations through it, leaning slightly toward each other to be heard, which produced an accidental intimacy that jet travel, smoother and quieter, never quite replicated. The aircraft smelled of machine oil and upholstery, and the specific, slightly metallic scent of recirculated cabin air that was unique to piston engine aviation. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was the smell of going somewhere significant on a machine that was working hard to take you there. And in the 1950s, when flying was still new enough to carry a charge of genuine wonder, that smell was inseparable from the feeling of departure. Boarding in the 1950s did not involve a Zone 5 announcement, a 6-inch shuffle toward a jetway, a passive competition for overhead bin space, or the experience of being briefly penalised for having a seat in the middle of the aircraft. There was no jetway to begin with. The jetway, that enclosed accordion bridge connecting terminal to aircraft door that modern travellers use without thinking, did not become standard at American airports until the early 1960s. Before it existed, you walked to the gate, and then you walked across the tarmac, outside, in the actual outdoor air, under the actual sky. This sounds like a minor point, but it was not a minor experience. The tarmac had a specific atmosphere, literally. The smell of aviation fuel hit you immediately, a sharp petroleum smell that became, for anyone who flew regularly, one of the sensory triggers of departure. The sound of propeller engines ticking over or idling added a physical texture to the air, a vibration that you felt before you heard it. The aircraft itself was right there, huge and metal and real in a way that the clinical, ESA's-filtered experience of a jetway never quite communicates. A machine sitting on the ground in full view, doing nothing to disguise what it was or what it was about to do. You walked toward it across the open ground, often alongside a small procession of other passengers, and if it was your first flight, or your 10th, or even your 50th, the sight of it up close produced something that the word boarding does not adequately capture. The mobile stairs, a wheeled set of steps that ground crew pushed into position against the aircraft door with a final approach. You climbed them, one step at a time, with your coat and your bag and your hat, while the wind did what wind does at airfields, and the propellers turned nearby with a casual power that you decided consciously not to think about in structural terms. At the top of the stairs, the aircraft door, and in the aircraft door a stewardess, composed and smiling, who welcomed you aboard with the specificity that the occasion demanded. Inside, the cabin was narrow by modern wide-body standards, but it didn't feel constricting. It felt purposeful. Everything was fitted and trimmed and upholstered with the care of a space that had been designed for people, rather than a loading manifest. The overhead bins, open shelves rather than enclosed compartments, held your coat and your smaller bag. Your seat was there in its row, wider than anything economy class currently offers, with its white starched headrest cover and its window view of the tarmac you just walked across, and the terminal building diminishing in the background. Some passengers on that tarmac walk were making this journey for the first time in their lives. You could occasionally identify them by the particular quality of attention they brought to everything, the way they looked at the aircraft, and then at the stairs, and then at the aircraft again, performing the specific mental calibration of a person who has understood intellectually for some time that human beings travel in these things, and is now being asked to become one of those human beings. The 1950s were early enough in the commercial aviation era that first flights were common, and the experience of the first flight had not yet been normalized into ordinariness. It was a moment. You were choosing to trust an enormous machine and the humans operating it to take you somewhere in a way that had no precedent in the entire history of your species until approximately 50 years before you were born. The orderly procession up the stairs, suits pressed and hats on, was a small collective act of courage dressed up as routine. The seats were wider. Let's just acknowledge that immediately, because it is the first thing any modern economy class traveller would notice upon taking their assigned place on a 1955 commercial flight, and it deserves its own moment before anything else is said. The seat was wider. Your elbows were not in contact with the person beside you. Your knees were not pressed against the seat in front. You could cross your legs, your actual legs, fully extended at the knee, without performing an operation that required the passive cooperation of the stranger to your left. The seat back in front of you was at a distance that allowed you to use it as a surface for your drink without endangering your ribcage. This is the baseline. This is what we're working with. The configuration on a typical domestic propeller aircraft in the mid-50s was 3 and 2 across, 3 seats on one side of the aisle, 2 on the other, or occasionally 2 and 2, which produced a cabin so generously proportioned that first-time passengers occasionally suspected they'd accidentally been upgraded. Legroom was not a product feature you paid extra for. It was simply the way seats were installed, because the aircraft weren't full enough, regularly enough, to make the airlines desperate to squeeze in additional rows. Load factors, the percentage of available seats that were actually occupied, were significantly lower than today's, which meant the person beside you might not exist, and if they did, the seat between you was a shared surface for coats and newspapers, and the general detritus of comfortable travel. The seat itself was upholstered in fabric rather than the wipe-clean vinyl of the budget era, and it reclined in a way that reclines are supposed to work, genuinely, meaningfully, without requiring an act of upper body force and without producing the specific social offence that modern seat recline causes. The headrest cover was a starched white slip cover, changed between flights, which sounds fussy until you consider that it meant the thing your head rested against was always clean. which is not a standard being reliably met in your current experience of commercial travel. The window was a porthole, round or oval, reasonably generous, positioned at the right height for a seated adult to look out without craning. The view from a propeller-era aircraft flying at 18 to 23,000 feet was different from the view from a modern jet at 35. You were lower, the ground was closer, the landscape had scale and texture and legibility, rather than the abstract geography of high-altitude flight. Flying over the Great Plains, you could see individual farms. Flying the coast, you could trace the shoreline. The world was not a map below you. It was the actual world, seen from an angle you didn't usually see it from, and this remained, even for frequent travellers, something that inspired a genuine response. On the Boeing Stratocruiser, the experience was categorically different. The downstairs cocktail lounge, 14 seats, curved bar, actual human bartender was reachable mid-flight via a spiral staircase located amidships. Passengers would leave their seats, descend the stairs with the unhurried confidence of people moving between rooms, order a drink, and spend 20 minutes in a subterranean social space below the main cabin, while the aircraft continued its journey several miles above the Earth. This was not considered excessive. This was the Stratocruiser. This was what you paid for, and if the turbulence picked up while you were on the bar stool, you held your drink with one hand and the bar with the other, which was just part of the experience, and which a significant number of passengers found clarifying in a way that perhaps the designers had not specifically intended. Here is the thing about propeller aircraft that the nostalgic photographs do not adequately communicate. They were extraordinarily, relentlessly, physically loud. Not jet engine loud, which is a high, focused, directional sound that modern acoustic engineering has reduced to a manageable background presence. Propeller loud, which was a low, grinding, cyclical thunder generated by 4 large piston engines running at high power for hours at a time, transmitted through the aircraft structure, through the cabin walls, through the floor beneath your feet, and into your body with the direct, unfiltered enthusiasm of machinery that has not been asked to be polite about itself. The frequency was the key thing. Jet engines produce a high-pitched roar that your brain, after a short period, learns to tune out. Propeller engines produced a low, slow, rhythmic throb, closer to the frequency of a large piece of industrial equipment than of anything your nervous system would naturally categorize as background noise. It found your chest. It found your back teeth. It set up residence in your sinuses and your inner ear and your general sense of where silence had last been available, and it stayed there for the duration of the flight, patient and thorough and entirely indifferent to your feelings about it. Conversation required adjustment. You leaned in. You raised your voice slightly, not to the undignified level of shouting, but to the level of a person speaking with deliberate projection in a noisy restaurant. A level at which everything you said felt slightly more pronounced than you intended. Private conversations became less private. Intimate remarks required either a willingness to be overheard by the adjacent seats or a physical proximity, mouth to ear. That was either charming or alarming, depending on your relationship with the person you were leaning toward. Reading required concentration of a particular kind, not the passive, drifting reading of a quiet room, but the active, engaged reading of a person who has decided to maintain focus in the presence of a constant distraction. Some passengers found this easier than others. Some found that the noise, paradoxically, helped, that its constancy produced a kind of white noise effect that crowded out other distractions and left only the page and the words and the steady throb of the engines as an oddly calming backdrop. These people were, by most measures, correct. The noise was consistent. Consistent noise is manageable. It was the sudden silences when the pilot adjusted engine power during descent. That produced the interesting expressions. Airlines attempted mitigation. Cotton wool earplugs were sometimes provided, distributed by the stewardess with the same matter-of-fact cheerfulness with which she distributed everything else, as if offering cotton wool to block out the sound of the aircraft's engines was a completely ordinary part of the service, and not a tacit acknowledgement that the aircraft was very loud. The seats were padded with sound-dampening material that did something, if not quite enough. The cabin walls were lined with acoustic insulation that represented the best available technology of the era, which was functional without being transformative. And then the engines changed. In October of 1958, the Boeing 707 entered commercial service, and the jet age began. And the noise changed from that deep, cyclic, physical throb to a cleaner, higher, more distant sound, present but filtered, mechanical but refined. Passengers on those first jet flights remarked on the smoothness, the speed, the remarkable quiet of the cabin. Several of them missed immediately and inexplicably the noise they had just left behind. Which tells you something about the human relationship with familiarity that probably generalizes to a lot of things beyond commercial aviation, but is particularly clear there. The cabin was, let's not dance around this, a smoking room. The entirety of the aircraft, from the moment the wheels left the runway to the moment they touched down again, and frankly for some time before and after both, was a space in which smoking was not just permitted but essentially assumed as the default condition of a passenger with hands and access to a pocket. Ashtrays were built into the armrests, not provided as an accessory, not clipped on as an afterthought, but built in, designed there from the beginning, by engineers who understood that the armrest was the natural resting place of a lit cigarette, and who accommodated this the way you'd accommodate any other ergonomic reality of the human body in a seated position. The ashtray was infrastructure. It was load-bearing, culturally speaking. The stewardess carried cigarettes for sale from a small tray that she moved through the cabin with the same professional ease with which she moved everything else. You could buy a pack mid-flight the way you might buy a drink or a newspaper. A casual transaction between two people who both considered it entirely normal, because it was entirely normal, because in 1955 approximately 45% of American adults smoked, and the other 55% had mostly decided not to make it anyone's business. The pilots smoked in the cockpit. This is documented. This is not an exaggeration for comedic effect. The flight crew smoked in the front of the aircraft, behind a door, while operating the aircraft, because they were adults and they wanted a cigarette, and there was no regulatory or social reason that they shouldn't have one. The man to your left smoked a pipe. Not a cigarette, a pipe, which required a specific sequence of packing, tamping, lighting, and relighting, and which produced a smoke profile that was richer, more complex, and considerably more intrusive than a standard cigarette, but which in the 1950s was associated with thoughtfulness and masculine contemplation, rather than with the phrase, "Please stop doing that." The woman behind you smoked something long and European, and held between two fingers at an angle that suggested she had practiced this specifically. The couple across the aisle shared cigarettes in the companionable way of people who share cigarettes, which is a particular form of social intimacy that has largely disappeared from the world along with the cigarettes. By the time you reached your destination, your hair had absorbed the collective tobacco choices of everyone in the cabin for the duration of the flight. Your suit had absorbed them. Your shirt, your tie, your socks, your carry-on bag, and the book you'd been reading had all absorbed them. You walked off the aircraft carrying a detailed olfactory record of everyone who had been smoking around you for the past several hours, and this was not a remark anyone made, because everyone walking off the aircraft was in the same condition, and because the smell of cigarette smoke was simply a pervasive feature of the 1950s environment in general, in restaurants, in offices, in cars, in living rooms, in hospitals, and distinguishing it as particularly notable in an aircraft cabin would have required a sensitivity to the specific that the era simply did not possess. The Surgeon General's report arrived in 1964. The no smoking sections appeared on domestic flights in 1973, initially occupying the last few rows of the aircraft in a configuration that anyone who has thought about airflow for 30 seconds will immediately recognise as optimistic. Full smoking bans on domestic flights shorter than 2 hours came in 1988. Total bans on all domestic routes followed in 1990. And in that final moment, when the last passenger stubbed out the last cigarette on the last flight where it was legal to do so, the armrest ashtrays, still built into the seats of older aircraft, became the small, chrome, recessed fossils of a completely different world. They're still there on some planes. Nobody uses them. But there they are, designed in, load-bearing, waiting. Airline food in the 1950s was not a punchline. It was a selling point, a genuine substantive, a competitive differentiator between carriers who could not compete on price because the government had fixed the price, and who therefore poured their competitive energy into every other dimension of the experience, of which the food was among the most visible and the most discussed. When TWA ran advertisements in Life magazine featuring their in-flight menu, alongside a photograph of the meal presented on a proper tray, they were not being ironic. They were making a legitimate claim. The food was good. In many cases, it was genuinely impressively good. Better than most restaurants on the ground. Certainly better than anything currently offered in the aluminum foil tray that passes for meal service on a modern domestic flight. The meals were served on real trays with real cutlery. Metal cutlery. Actual forks and knives and spoons with the airline's logo on the handle, washed and reused. Not the flimsy plastic set that comes sealed in a small bag with a wet wipe and a packet of salt that's slightly too small to be useful. There were cloth napkins folded and presented. There was a starter, typically a small salad or a cold appetizer of the shrimp cocktail variety, because this was the 1950s, and shrimp cocktail was what civilization had recently decided to do with shrimp. There was a main course, which had been prepared in the aircraft's galley kitchen by the stewardess working within the specific constraints of an airborne kitchen, which were real constraints, and which the better airlines had developed systematic procedures for managing so that what arrived at your tray table was hot, recognisable, and something you could describe positively to the people who asked you about your flight afterward. The entree on a premium domestic route in the mid-50s might be a carved roast beef, served with roasted potatoes and vegetables, or a chicken dish prepared with a sauce that indicated someone in the airline's catering department had consulted an actual recipe. On transoceanic routes with Pan Am or TWA, the meal expanded into something approaching a full restaurant experience. Multiple courses, cheese service, dessert presented separately, coffee and a digestif at the end. The whole progression timed to the length of the flight, with the thoughtfulness of a dinner party host who had planned the menu around the duration of your visit. The presentation mattered. The stewardess placed your meal with attention rather than velocity. The tray was arranged so that things were where you'd expect them. The hot things were hot, and the cold things had not been sitting long enough to become room temperature in the specific dispiriting way of airline food that has given up on itself. You ate with the window beside you showing several thousand feet of open sky, and the engine throb underneath everything, and the combination of the formal meal service and the extraordinary circumstances of its delivery produced an experience that frequent flyers took for granted and first-time flyers remembered for decades. The catch, and there was one, because altitude is the catch in almost every otherwise pleasant aspect of aviation, was that your taste buds at cruising altitude are not your taste buds on the ground. The low humidity of pressurized cabins dries out your nasal passages, reducing your sense of smell, and with it a significant portion of your sense of taste. Food that would be robustly flavoured at sea level tastes flatter at altitude. The airlines of the 1950s did not know precisely why this was. The research came later, but the better chefs in airline catering had intuited the problem and compensated by seasoning more aggressively than they would have on the ground. The result was food that tasted correct in the air, which was the only place that mattered, because that was where you were. The bar was open, fully, generously, enthusiastically, and on most carriers without any additional charge open, because in the 1950s, the relationship between commercial aviation and alcohol was one of deep, institutionalized mutual encouragement. Yeah, and because the airlines had independently arrived at the understanding that a passenger who was drinking was a passenger who was not thinking about the fact that they were inside a pressurized metal tube at 20,000 feet, being held aloft by aerodynamics and optimism. The drinks were, in this sense, a public service. They were also genuinely good drinks served in actual glassware by a trained professional, which elevated them above the category of mere anxiolytic. The martini was the emblematic drink of the 50s aircraft cabin. Cold, clear, precise. Arrived at your tray table with an olive and a stem and the quiet confidence of a drink that knew exactly what it was. You could have it before takeoff, which sounds irresponsible until you consider that the flight to Los Angeles was 6 hours and you had gotten up at 5 in the morning to make it to the airport, and a martini at 10:15 was, under those circumstances, not a character statement but a reasonable adjustment. You could have a second one during the meal. You could have a scotch after the meal. You could have a brandy with the coffee. None of this required a conversation. You simply indicated what you wanted, the stewardess brought it, and the transaction was handled with the mutual adult understanding that drinking on an airplane was a completely normal thing to do and not a behaviour requiring commentary from either party. The alcohol hit harder at altitude. This is physiology rather than opinion. The lower cabin pressure reduces the partial pressure of oxygen in your blood slightly, which combined with the dehydrating effect of dry cabin air means that your body processes alcohol differently than it does at sea level. The standard estimate, which every flight attendant training manual eventually came to include, is that one drink at altitude produces the effect of approximately 1.5 drinks on the ground. The 1950s did not have this information in wide circulation, which meant passengers who had consumed what they considered a moderate amount of in-flight alcohol occasionally arrived at their destinations in a condition that was mildly more festive than they'd planned. This was not considered a problem. It was considered at most a mild social footnote, the kind of thing you'd mention at the office the next morning with a rueful grin and a reference to those TWA martinis, and your colleagues would nod with the knowing recognition of people who had also encountered TWA martinis, and emerged from the encounter with revised estimates of their own tolerance. The culture had not yet developed the particular modern anxiety about visible drinking that characterises the current era. A person who'd had a few drinks on an airplane was a person who'd had a few drinks on an airplane. The judgment was minimal and the sympathy from fellow passengers who'd had a few drinks on an airplane was substantial. International routes went further. On transoceanic Pan Am flights, the drink service was continuous, structured, and comprehensive in the way of a dinner party where the host has made a decision about the evening. Champagne on departure, wine with the meal, red or white, your choice, poured from an actual bottle. A liqueur option with the cheese. Port if you wanted port. The whole progression managed by a stewardess who'd been trained to pace the service against the flight duration, so that passengers arrived at their destination pleasantly convivial, rather than structurally compromised. This was a professional skill. It required judgment. Most of them were very good at it. Propeller aircraft flew lower than modern jets. This is a fact with consequences that the brochures, which were full of sunsets and smiling stewardesses and zero atmospheric meteorology, did not dwell on. Where today's commercial jets cruise comfortably above most weather systems at 35,000 feet, looking down at cloud formations from a position of serene superiority, the DC-6 and Constellation and Stratocruiser flew at between 18 and 23,000 feet, right in the middle of whatever the atmosphere happened to be doing that afternoon, which on a summer afternoon over the Midwest was frequently something vigorous and entirely uninterested in your travel plans. Turbulence in a propeller aircraft was a different physical experience than turbulence in a modern jet. Jets are heavier, faster, and their high-altitude cruise keeps them above much of the disturbed air that affects lower-flying aircraft. Propeller planes were lighter relative to their surface area, flew in weather rather than above it, and communicated every pocket of disturbed air to the cabin with a fidelity that left nothing to the imagination. A mild bump in a modern jet produces a brief ripple through the cabin and a cheerful chime from the seatbelt sign. A moderate air pocket in a Constellation produced an event, a sudden drop or lateral shift that sent drinks across tray tables and produced expressions on the faces of first-time flyers that contained the complete, unedited text of everything they were feeling. The stewardess continued to smile. This was not indifference or denial. It was professional discipline of a high order, the result of training that had specifically prepared her for the distinction between turbulence that required action and turbulence that required composure, and for the understanding that displaying composure was itself a form of action when you were in a cabin full of passengers looking to her for cues about how seriously to take the situation. She moved through the aisle during moderate chop with the practiced balance of someone who had developed sea legs for the sky, one hand occasionally touching a seat back for stability, her expression suggesting that this was a minor inconvenience rather than a structural conversation between the aircraft and the weather. The pilot made no announcement in most cases. The culture of the cockpit announcement as passenger reassurance had not yet fully developed. The captain's domain was the front of the aircraft, and what happened there, the corrections, the altitude changes, the small adjustments made in response to conditions that the passengers couldn't see, was professional business conducted at a professional remove from the people in the back. If it was genuinely severe, someone might come on the intercom with the calm, authoritative non-explanation that we covered in a later segment. Otherwise, the turbulence was simply something happening, like weather outside a building, present, physical, and not specifically your problem to solve. The practical consequences for the meal service were what they were. A 3-course dinner served at altitude during turbulence required a stewardess with considerable skill, a passenger with considerable faith, and a tray table with rim edges that had been designed by someone who had thought carefully about fluid dynamics. The martini was the highest risk item. It had no lid. It was full of clear liquid. It was sitting on a surface attached to the seat in front of you by a single hinge, and when the aircraft moved unexpectedly, the martini had opinions about this and expressed them directly onto your lap. This happened. It happened to well-dressed people. Nobody really blamed anyone. The stewardess brought a cloth. Someone made a dry remark. The journey continued. The captain of a 1950s commercial aircraft occupied a social position somewhere between elite professional and minor secular deity, and he occupied it with a completeness that made the distinction largely academic. He was almost certainly a veteran of the Second World War or Korea. The timing of the war and the timing of commercial aviation's expansion created a generation of airline pilots who had come to their cockpits via military aircraft, considerably more demanding than anything in civilian service, flown in conditions that made turbulence over Illinois seem almost recreational, and who arrived at their airline careers with the specific psychological profile of a person who had decided at some earlier point that visible concern was not part of the job description. He wore 4 stripes on his sleeve. In the hierarchy of mid-century American professional dress, these 4 stripes communicated authority more efficiently than almost any other visible signal available to a man who wasn't wearing a general star's or a judge's robes. The hat was the other component, as a peaked cap with the airline's insignia on the front, brim squared, crown correct, worn with the automatic authority of someone who had worn a uniform hat for so long that the hat and the person had reached an agreement about each other. The hat said, "This man is in charge of the machine. This man has decided what is going to happen. This man would like you to feel comfortable about this," and his hat concurs. He sometimes walked the cabin. This was a practice with no operational necessity. The aircraft flew itself in cruise, to the extent that 1950s autopilot systems permitted, and the cockpit was where the captain's skills were required, but which served a powerful social function. A captain who appeared in the aisle, exchanged a few words with selected passengers, answered a question or two with unflappable calm, and then returned forward was a captain who had performed the specific act of making the aircraft personal. He was not a voice on the intercom. He was a man in a hat who had looked you in the eye and implicitly told you, without saying anything of the kind, that everything was fine and that you could go back to your martini. The passengers responded to this with something close to reverence. The captain was the known expert in the room, the person for whom everything that was happening was normal, calibrated, within the range of professional experience. In a time when commercial aviation was still recent enough to carry a residual charge of genuine adventure, his composure was the external evidence that the adventure was in fact managed. You watched him walk back to the cockpit and you felt something relax in your chest that you hadn't realised was tightened. The accident statistics, which were improving steadily through the decades, supported this confidence. 1950s commercial aviation was not as safe as today's. Nothing in the history of aviation is as safe as today's, but it was far safer than the decade before it, and the men flying the aircraft were extraordinarily skilled. They had been tested in ways that no commercial certification process fully replicated. They had reserves of practical experience that the training manuals captured imperfectly. They were, as a professional cohort, exceptional. The hat was earned, the 4 stripes were earned, and the specific quality of calm that settled over a cabin when the captain walked through it was earned too. Then not a performance, but the natural bearing of a person who had been in actual danger and had retained, from that experience, the permanent gift of perspective. Everything else, including turbulence over Nebraska, was simply weather. And weather, as the captain's hat reminded you, was the sort of thing they had planned for. Air travel in the 1950s was statistically safer than it had been in the 40s, and would continue to improve through the decade with a persistence that the industry found encouraging, and the newspapers found disappointingly unexciting. The accident rate per mile flown was declining year over year. The aircraft were better. The navigation systems were improving. The weather forecasting, while modest by contemporary standards, was getting more useful. By any objective measure, flying was getting safer, and the people responsible for it knew this, and they communicated it in their advertising with the enthusiasm of a group who had worked very hard on something and would like credit for it. None of this fully addressed the fear, because the fear was not primarily a response to statistics. It was a response to the existential quality of the situation, the fact that you were inside a machine, off the ground, in the air, with nothing below you for a considerable distance and no means of individually influencing what happened next. Statistics are intellectual constructs. The view from the window of a propeller aircraft at 20,000 feet over the Appalachians is not an intellectual construct. It is a direct sensory experience of height and exposure that the human nervous system is still running on hardware calibrated for a world when nothing larger than a bird went airborne. Processes with a distinct lack of enthusiasm. The culture provided no comfortable outlet for this. In the 1950s, the social framework around flying was aggressively positive. The airlines were running advertisements that depicted aviation as the apex of modern civilization, glamorous, progressive, a privilege of the sophisticated traveller. The magazines ran features about jet travel with a breathless tone of press releases, which several of them essentially were. The collective narrative was that flying was wonderful, and that people who felt otherwise were either misinformed or constitutionally unsuited to the modern world, which was a social judgment severe enough to ensure that most frightened flyers kept their fear private and their drinks frequent. You did not tell the person beside you that you were frightened. You ordered your drink. You opened your magazine. You looked out the window with a practiced expression of someone who looked at things from 20,000 feet all the time and found it perfectly normal and was not currently running internal calculations about the consequences of an engine failure over western Kansas. You presented the exterior of a person for whom this was routine, while the interior did whatever the interior was doing, which was its own business and nobody else's. The coping strategies were pragmatic. Alcohol, as discussed. Conversation, which occupied the mind with social content and left less bandwidth for structural analysis of the aircraft. Reading, which worked for some people and didn't work for others, depending on whether their concentration was stronger than their anxiety, and a particular technique employed by experienced nervous flyers everywhere. The deliberate interpretation of every sound and movement as evidence of normalcy. That noise from the engine. Normal. The aircraft has 4 engines and they're all making noises and every single one of them is exactly right. That vibration through the floor of a propeller aircraft always does that. The stewardess walking calmly past, a person whose job requires her to know when something is wrong, and she's not behaving as if something is wrong, therefore nothing is wrong. The construction of reassurance from available evidence was a skill, and frequent flyers developed it with the quiet industriousness of people who had decided to fly regularly and needed to make peace with a decision. Flying from New York to London in the 1950s was not a 6-hour inconvenience, followed by a slightly disorienting walk through Heathrow and a black cab into the city. It was a commitment, a full, conscious, planned-in-advance commitment of somewhere between 14 and 18 hours, depending on the aircraft, the routing, and the number of stops required to keep the aircraft's fuel tanks in a condition its engineers considered appropriate. The Atlantic was a formidable thing. The propeller aircraft of the early 50s did not have the range to cross it non-stop from the American eastern seaboard, and so they didn't. They stopped. Gander, Newfoundland, is a small city on the northeastern tip of Canada that owes its entire mid-20th century existence to its geographic position. It was the closest point on the North American continent to Europe, and it had an airfield, and those two facts made it the compulsory refueling stop for virtually every transatlantic propeller flight operated in the era before jet aircraft made non-stop crossings routine. You would board your flight in New York, fly for 5 to 6 hours, land in Gander at whatever time the math produced, often the middle of the night, because departure times were set by the New York end, and Gander was simply wherever you landed when the arithmetic ran out. Walk through a small terminal that smelled of coffee in the specific cold of Newfoundland in most months of the year, wait for an hour and reboard. The Gander Airport terminal was not glamorous. It was functional in the way that something serving a very specific purpose in a very specific place is functional, clean, reasonably staffed, offering coffee and sandwiches in the slightly stunned atmosphere of a building through which large numbers of people were constantly passing at unreasonable hours while none of them particularly wanted to be there. Passengers who'd been asleep on the aircraft woke up for Gander, walked the terminal with the confused purpose of the recently awakened, bought a coffee, stared at a postcard rack, and reboarded the aircraft for the second leg with the philosophical equanimity of people who had known about Gander when they bought the ticket. The full journey required a certain mental reframing that transoceanic ship travellers had already developed and that early aviation passengers were learning. You were not going from New York to London. You were going on a journey, and the journey had phases, and Gander was one of the phases, and you arranged yourself mentally to accommodate this rather than fighting it. The crossing from Southampton to New York by ship had taken 5 days. 14 hours with a stop in Newfoundland was, by that measure, essentially instantaneous. The reference class for the experienced traveller of the early 50s was the ocean liner, and against that benchmark anything aviation offered was miraculous. The aircraft on transatlantic routes were the prestige machines, Constellations operated by TWA, Boeing Stratocruisers operated by Pan Am and BOAC, the most capable and the most luxuriously configured aircraft in each airline's fleet. They had to be, because the passenger who was spending this much money and committing this much time expected the experience to justify itself at every stage. The meals were better. The service was more attentive. The seat configurations gave you more room for the simple reason that you were going to be in the seat for long enough that insufficient room was a genuine problem rather than an inconvenience. The drinks were continuous, and the conversation, by the time you reached the midpoint of the Atlantic with nothing in any direction but water, had a quality of intimacy that geography alone produced. The specific candour of a group of strangers suspended together between two continents, with no particular ability to go anywhere else for the next several hours. In October of 1958, something happened that split commercial aviation into a clean before and after, a line as clear as any in the history of the industry, visible only in retrospect but immediately felt by everyone who crossed it. Pan American Airways launched the first scheduled transatlantic jet service using the Boeing 707, and the world of flying that had existed for the previous decade, propeller-driven, low-altitude, fuel-stopping in Gander, gloriously over-catered and constitutively loud, began its rapid transformation into something its participants would not entirely recognise and would spend varying amounts of time mourning. The 707 was faster, not incrementally faster, but categorically. Transatlantic crossings that had taken 14 hours with a Newfoundland intermission now took 8 hours non-stop, which in practical terms meant that the overnight flight to London was a different kind of thing entirely. It was smoother. The jet engines produced thrust without the low-frequency vibration of the piston engines, and the aircraft flew at 35,000 feet, above most weather, above the atmospheric turbulence that had characterized propeller-era travel, in a stratum of the sky where the air was thin and cold and calm, and the business of getting from one place to another could be conducted without periodic physical input from the atmosphere. It was quieter in the relative sense. The jet engines were loud in their own way, a high and sustained roar on takeoff that levelled off into a background presence during cruise, but the specific chest-level throb of 4 radial piston engines was gone, and its absence changed the character of the cabin in ways that were immediately recognisable and somehow slightly disorienting. The airlines understood that the introduction of the 707 was a marketing event as much as an operational one, and they treated it accordingly. Pan Am's inaugural service was covered by the press with the energy of a moon landing, which, in terms of what it changed about the human experience of moving between continents, was not an entirely inappropriate comparison. The aircraft was new. The speed was unprecedented. The idea that you could have breakfast in New York and dinner in London on the same day was genuinely novel and produced in the people experiencing it for the first time a specific variety of wonder that was entirely rational, given what had been possible 12 months earlier. What nobody quite anticipated, or at least didn't say out loud, was what would be lost. The propeller era had produced a kind of travel that was slow enough to have texture, long enough that the journey itself was a significant portion of the experience, with its meals and its stops and its communities of strangers thrown together for many hours at altitude. Jet travel compressed the journey and elevated the destination, which was efficient and in almost every objective sense better, and which also changed the social character of the aircraft cabin from something resembling a floating dinner party to something more like a very fast bus. The glamour persisted for a while. The 707 was new and impressive, and the airlines maintained their standard of service through the early jet years with considerable effort. But the compression of the journey time worked against the theatre of the experience. 6 hours across the Atlantic was not short enough to be negligible, but it was short enough that the whole elaborate apparatus of the long flight, the multiple courses, the cocktail lounge descent, the gander stop, the mid-ocean intimacy, no longer had the space to fully develop. The jet age gave you speed. The propeller age had given you the journey. And for a small but specific category of traveller, the exchange felt quietly and irrationally like a loss. In the era before airline deregulation, which wouldn't arrive until 1978, and whose arrival would eventually produce the low-cost, high-volume, please select your seat upgrade for only $49 industry we currently inhabit, American commercial aviation operated under the regulatory thumb of the Civil Aeronautics Board, a federal body that did many things, the most operationally significant of which was fixing the price of airline tickets. Every carrier on every domestic route charged the same fare. The government had decided this, and the government's decision was effective, and so the price competition between airlines that drives almost every other consumer industry was simply absent. It didn't exist. It was not a factor. A ticket from New York to Chicago on American cost exactly the same as a ticket on United, which cost exactly the same as a ticket on TWA, and everyone knew this, and the airlines competed with each other on everything else instead. This produced, as competitive constraints often do, an extraordinarily creative response. If you cannot win on price, you win on the meal, you win on the uniform, you win on the frequency of the smiling, on the thread count of the pillow cover, on the font of the destination sign at the gate, on the specific shade of blue of the carpet in the terminal lounge that you've paid to have built to your aesthetic specifications, so that passengers begin experiencing your brand before they've reached the aircraft. You win on the advertising, the copy, the imagery, the promise of an experience that your competitor, flying the same route with the same aircraft at the same fare, has somehow failed to make as compelling. TWA, shaped by the eccentric genius of Howard Hughes, positioned itself as the glamour option, the airline for people who understood that flying was not merely transportation, but a statement about the quality of life one expected. Its advertising in the 1950s operated at the intersection of aspiration and romance, featuring imagery that suggested destinations worth reaching and an experience worth having on the way. Pan-American, with its transoceanic roots and its international character, leaned into sophisticated globalism. The airline for people who went places that required a passport, which in the 1950s was a considerably more exclusive demographic than it is today. Pan Am didn't just fly you to Europe. Pan Am inducted you, briefly, into the world of people who went to Europe, and it did this through the food and the service and the uniforms and the specific quality of attention that its staff had been trained to provide. United sold reliability, the airline that got you there, on time, without incident, with appropriate professionalism and no particular drama. American sold frequency and reach, the most routes, the most departures, the network that covered the country with the thoroughness of a carrier that had decided breadth was its competitive position and was investing accordingly. Eastern sold Florida, which in the 1950s was the destination of a considerable portion of American recreational flying, and which Eastern understood as well as any carrier understood its core market. Everyone, without exception, they sold the general proposition that flying was wonderful and modern, and that their specific version of it was the most wonderful and modern available. The competition produced, for the passenger, a golden age of service that the economics of deregulation would eventually make impossible. When survival required differentiating on experience, the experience was differentiated on. When survival required only filling seats at the lowest possible cost per available seat mile, experience became secondary, then tertiary. then the subject of a nostalgic documentary on a streaming service, watched by people in middle seats eating purchased snacks from a paper bag. Pan American World Airways in the 1950s occupied a position in American cultural life that no airline today comes close to approximating, and perhaps no company in any industry fully replicates, a position in which a private corporation had become so thoroughly identified with a national project, a national character, and a national aspiration that distinguishing between the brand and the thing the brand represented had become genuinely difficult. Pan Am was not just a company that flew airplanes between places. It was, in its own self-understanding, and in the understanding of the culture that surrounded it, the airborne expression of America itself, its technology, its confidence, its willingness to go everywhere and do everything, and make it look easy and offer you a good meal while it happened. The routes were the first dimension of this. Pan Am flew to more countries, on more continents, and over more oceans than any competitor. When it said World Airways in its name, it meant it in the literal operational sense. The airline had pioneered trans-Pacific routes in the late 1930s with its flying boats, the China Clippers, and had entered the post-war era with an international network that no domestic carrier could match, because most domestic carriers weren't designed for international operation, and Pan Am had never really been designed for anything else. It flew to Europe, it flew to South America, it flew to Asia, it flew to Africa. It flew, ultimately, to the Soviet Union, a route whose political implications were not lost on anyone involved, and whose establishment required the kind of diplomatic navigation that would typically have been handled by actual diplomats rather than airline executives. The aircraft were the best available. Pan Am had a relationship with Boeing that was partly commercial and partly something closer to partnership. The airline's requirements shaped aircraft design in ways that benefited the entire industry. When Pan Am ordered the Boeing 707 in the mid-50s, the order was large enough that it essentially confirmed the 707's development and gave Boeing the financial foundation to build it. When Pan Am subsequently ordered the Boeing 747, its requirements again shaped the aircraft's configuration. Pan Am wasn't just buying Boeing's products, it was, in a meaningful sense, commissioning them. The first-class cabin on a Pan Am transoceanic flight was the closest approximation of a flying dinner party that commercial aviation produced. The stewardesses, selected with the same rigorous specificity as domestic carriers, but with additional language requirements for international routes, provided a service calibrated to the length and significance of the journey. The food was planned by people who understood that a meal at altitude over the Atlantic was a different occasion than dinner in a New York restaurant, and that different occasions required different responses. The wines were selected, the service was paced, the whole experience communicated at every point that you were not simply being transported between two cities, but were participating in something that the airline took seriously, and that you were therefore entitled to take seriously yourself. The Blue Globe logo was recognizable in airports from Tokyo to Buenos Aires to Lagos to Rome, a visual shorthand for American reach, American capability, American confidence in its own ability to go places and do things. In countries where the American government's reputation was complicated, Pan Am's was often simpler. It was the airline that came, that was reliable, that had good food and trained staff and aircraft that worked. It was America as it preferred to be seen, and for 2 decades at least the image and the reality were close enough together that the distinction didn't much matter. If you had, in 1955, walked into the offices of American Airlines or United or TWA with the goal of becoming a stewardess, you would have encountered a hiring process so specific in its requirements, so unapologetic in its criteria, and so comprehensive in its rejection of anyone who didn't meet every single one of them simultaneously, that reading it today produces a cocktail of disbelief and retrospective fury that takes a moment to metabolize. The requirements were not suggestions. They were not guidelines. They were a list, and the list was long, and every item on it was enforced with the cheerful precision of an industry that had decided exactly what it wanted and saw no reason to be coy about it. You had to be female. You had to be single. Marriage was grounds for immediate termination at most carriers. A policy enforced with a directness that today reads as breathtaking, and that at the time was simply the terms of employment, accepted or not accepted, with no intermediate position available. You had to be between 20 and 26 years of age, above which you were considered by the operational logic of the era to have aged out of the role in some way that nobody was ever precisely specific about, but that everyone in the industry clearly agreed upon. You had to be between 5'2" and 5'8", shorter, and you couldn't reach the overhead compartments, taller, and the ceiling of the aircraft cabin became a daily negotiation. You had to weigh between 100 and 135 pounds, a requirement that was not self-reported but verified at regular intervals by an actual scale in the airline's offices, administered by an actual person with a clipboard, which is an experience whose specific indignity is difficult to fully appreciate from the present. You had to have vision correctable to 2020. You had to have no visible scars. You had to speak clearly. You had to be, in the precise language of the era's hiring materials, pleasant-looking, a qualification so magnificently vague that it covered everything and committed to nothing and allowed the interviewer maximum discretion in applying it. And after all of that, after clearing every physical and demographic criterion on the list, you still had to interview. And the interview was its own event. You sat across from a representative of the airline who was evaluating your poise, your articulateness, your apparent warmth, your capacity to project calm in the face of difficulty, and your general suitability for a role that required you to perform hospitality at altitude with the simultaneous competence of a first responder. The questions were the kind of questions that tested composure as much as content, designed to see whether you became flustered, whether you reached for your words, whether you could maintain the specific quality of measured pleasantness that the job required even when the conversation was uncomfortable. Most applicants didn't pass this stage. The ones who did were, by any fair measure, exceptional. Training followed, a residential program of several weeks that covered emergency procedures with the seriousness of a military course, and meal service with the attention of a hospitality school, because both were genuinely required and neither was considered more important than the other. You learnt the aircraft's emergency exits by their positions rather than their labels, because in an actual emergency the labels might not be visible and your memory had to be physical. You learned first aid well enough to manage a medical situation at 30,000 feet without ground support. You learned the galley systems, the service sequences, the correct way to open a wine bottle in a moving aircraft, the specific technique of walking an aisle in heels during turbulence without making it look like walking an aisle in heels during turbulence. When you emerged from training, you had a uniform, a set of wings, a route assignment, and a weight limit that would be checked at the start of every working month for the duration of your employment. You also had a career that would end by policy when you married or when you turned 32, whichever came first. The window was narrow. The requirements were extraordinary. The women who met them and flew those routes were, by the evidence of everything they were asked to do and be, among the most capable professionals in the American workforce of their era. The industry called them stewardesses. The word didn't come close. The intersection of 1950s aviation and 1950s medicine produced some genuinely memorable moments in the history of people being confidently, authoritatively, completely wrong in ways that took decades to fully correct. Aviation medicine was a young field in the mid-50s, younger than the aircraft, younger than the airlines, and in many respects still catching up with the operational realities it was attempting to address. The researchers were good. The intentions were sound. The conclusions were, in a number of cases, the conclusions that the available data supported. And the available data was incomplete in ways that the researchers did not yet know were incomplete, which is the specific epistemic situation that produces the most confidently delivered incorrect advice. Passengers with pre-existing health conditions were advised, in the earnest good faith of the era, to consult their physician before booking a flight. Their physicians, consulting the available literature and their own clinical experience of what happened to patients at altitude, which was, for most general practitioners in 1955, limited, gave advice that ranged from perfectly sound to spectacularly creative. The concern about cabin pressure was real and legitimate. The pressurized cabins of the era were maintained at an equivalent altitude of somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 feet, lower than the aircraft's actual cruising altitude, but still high enough to have physiological effects on passengers with respiratory or cardiac conditions. This was a genuine consideration, honestly communicated, and the advice to consult a doctor before flying was not wrong. What surrounded that core of good advice was a penumbra of confident speculation that the era was particularly good at generating. Some physicians advised patients with nervous dispositions to avoid window seats, on the theory that the view of altitude might produce anxiety responses that would complicate the flight. This was not without logic. It had logic. The logic just turned out to be less determinative than the physician suggested. Others recommended specific dietary preparations before flying. Light meals, avoidance of gas-producing foods. The logic being that the change in cabin pressure would cause gases in the digestive system to expand, which was actually true and remains true, and which the medical community's response to was a dietary briefing rather than a mention that the discomfort was temporary and manageable. Eat nothing exciting before you board. Show up for your transatlantic flight in a condition of carefully managed gastrointestinal neutrality. Arrive in London ready for dinner. The brandy recommendation appears with sufficient frequency in the medical literature and popular advice columns of the era that it deserves specific acknowledgement. A small glass of brandy before takeoff was suggested, by actual physicians in actual publications, as a means of settling the nerves and managing the physiological adjustment to altitude. The suggestion was not entirely without merit. Brandy is a vasodilator, and the mildly anxious passenger who had a small one before boarding was, anecdotally, often calmer than the one who hadn't. That the recommended treatment for pre-flight anxiety was a drink is either a marvel of practical medicine or a window into a culture's relationship with alcohol that tells you more about the culture than about the medicine, and possibly both simultaneously. The airline's own medical guidance, distributed to passengers on request or included with ticket materials on certain routes, was produced with the graphic confidence of a pamphlet that knows it is the authoritative word on the subject. It covered pressure changes, recommended ear-clearing techniques for descent, which was sound and remained current practice, and offered reassurance about the safety of the aircraft that was mathematically accurate and emotionally calibrated to the passenger who needed it most. What it did not cover, because the research hadn't produced it yet, was anything about the effect of altitude on alcohol metabolism, the specific dehydration dynamics of pressurized cabin air, or the cumulative fatigue produced by crossing multiple time zones in a single day. Those were the discoveries that came later. In the meantime, the brandy was a fine idea, and the light meal was sensible, and the window seat was up to you. The lavatory of a 1950s Propeller aircraft was a small room that had been designed by someone with a thorough understanding of geometry and a somewhat theoretical relationship with the experience of using it. It was clean. Airlines were meticulous about this, understanding that the condition of the lavatory was a direct communication about the standards of the operation, and that a passenger who found a dirty lavatory had received information about the airline that no amount of good meal service would fully correct. It was stocked with soap and paper towels and a small mirror, and the modest dignity of a space that had been appointed with care within its considerable constraints. The constraints were considerable. The floor area was approximately the size of a generous closet. The ceiling was low enough that anyone above average height had a decision to make about their posture. The door opened inward, which meant that operating it required a brief, awkward sequence of body movements, turning sideways, pulling the door toward you while simultaneously moving yourself to accommodate the door's arc that was manageable in calm air and became a small physical comedy during turbulence. There was no luggage rack because there was no space for a luggage rack, which meant that anyone attempting to freshen up in the lavatory was doing so while also managing their handbag, which they had brought because the lavatory had no hook capable of holding it, and their coat, which they had brought because the overhead shelf above their seat was already committed to someone else's hat. The mirror was the correct size for its purpose, large enough to see your face, small enough to remind you that this was an aircraft lavatory and not a dressing room. The lighting was functional, which in the specific language of aircraft lavatories meant fluorescent and unforgiving in the way that fluorescent lighting is always unforgiving, presenting you to yourself in a quality of light that no human being has ever looked at and thought, yes, this is the best version of this. You looked at yourself in the aircraft lavatory mirror in 1955, and you looked like a person who had been sitting in a pressurized cabin for several hours, breathing recirculated air while everyone around them smoked, because that was what you were, and the mirror confirmed it with the neutrality of mirrors everywhere. On the Boeing Stratocruiser, the lavatory situation was somewhat more generous. The aircraft's size allowed for facilities that didn't require the same creative spatial negotiation. On the Lockheed Constellation, it was the opposite. The Constellation's distinctive curved fuselage, beautiful from the outside and lyrical in its aerodynamic purpose, produced interior geometry that was at its most challenging in the lavatory, where the curved wall met the confined space to create a room that required a specific orientation to use comfortably and a slightly different specific orientation to leave. The queue for the lavatory was its own social institution. On a full flight, it formed with the patient resignation of people who'd all made the same calculation about timing and arrived at the same conclusion simultaneously. You stood in the aisle, holding a seat back for stability if the aircraft was moving, or waiting with the particular politeness of a line in which everyone understood everyone else's situation, and nobody was going to make it worse by being difficult about it. When the door opened, and the previous occupant emerged with the careful expression of someone resuming their public self, you entered, managed the inward opening door, and spent the necessary time in the fluorescent light before rejoining the cabin with a briskness that acknowledged you had been somewhere and were now back, and that no further discussion was required. This was the understood protocol. Everyone followed it. Even at 20,000 feet, certain social contracts hold. Nobody talked about it. This was the understanding, the collective, and unspoken agreement of everyone in the cabin that certain experiences were private in the way that certain experiences simply are, regardless of how visible they become or how much the aircraft is contributing to them. But everyone knew someone who had experienced it. Most people who flew regularly in the Propeller era had experienced it themselves, at least once, at least mildly, that specific, unmistakable progression from fine to not fine that began somewhere in the middle of the flight, and that no amount of looking at the horizon, which you couldn't really see from inside the aircraft anyway, fully addressed. Motion sickness on a Propeller-era flight was not a rare event. The aircraft's operating altitude put it in weather rather than above it. The low-frequency vibration of the piston engines transmitted through the airframe and into the vestibular system, with a consistency that your inner ear, still running its original factory settings from an era when nothing moved like this, found epistemologically challenging. Your eyes told you one thing: the cabin was stationary, the seat was stationary, the tray table was stationary. Your inner ear told you something else, something about movement and orientation that did not reconcile cleanly with what your eyes were reporting. The brain received both inputs simultaneously and responded by being unhelpful. The paper bag was in the seat back pocket, not prominently displayed, not advertised in the manner of a safety card, not accompanied by instructions or a note about its purpose. It was simply there, in the pocket, positioned with the quiet practicality of people who had learned from experience that it needed to be there, and that it needed to be reachable without ceremony or delay. A veteran traveller looking at that paper bag in the seat back pocket knew exactly what it was for, and filed this information away without comment. A first-time flyer discovered its purpose either before they needed it, in which case they felt briefly sobered, or at the moment they needed it, in which case the design of the pocket placement represented the most thoughtful piece of human factors engineering they had ever encountered. The stewardess had protocols. When it happened, when the evidence became visible, when the passenger's expression communicated what words were not going to be used to communicate, she responded with a specific combination of efficiency and discretion that was one of the more impressive professional performances in the service industry. She arrived. She provided what was needed. She managed the situation with the minimum of fuss and the maximum of invisibility, so that the other passengers, who had noticed in the way that people in a confined space always notice, but who did not want to have noticed, were given something close to a graceful exit from the awareness. She then returned to the galley and continued the service with the unbothered continuity of someone for whom this was a known variable in the job description, because it was. The cultural silence around motion sickness was matched by a practical silence about its causes. The 1950s did not have Dramamine in wide circulation. The drug had been discovered in the late 40s and was available, but it was not yet the standard pre-flight recommendation that it would become, and many passengers who would have benefited from it didn't know to take it. The airline's pre-flight materials did not suggest it. Your physician, unless you specifically raised the subject, did not raise it. You boarded the aircraft and you hoped for smooth air, which was the only real solution available to you, and when the air was not smooth, you had the seatback pocket and the stewardess and the quiet dignity of an experience that everyone understood and nobody discussed, which is occasionally the most civilized response available. Before jets and their extended range made non-stop transcontinental travel not just possible but expected, many domestic routes involved a stopover, and the word stopover, with its implication of brief pause and quiet inconvenience, undersells what these intermediate landings actually were as an experience. They were not connections in the modern sense, where you sprint between gates in a vast airport with 17 minutes to make your next flight, while pulling a wheeled bag that has developed opinions about the direction of travel. They were planned pauses, scheduled breathing room built into the itinerary by the airline and accepted by the passenger as a known feature of the journey, like the meal service and the complimentary cigarettes, something that was going to happen and that you arrange yourself to accommodate. Your flight from New York to Los Angeles in 1955 might land in Kansas City, or Dallas, or Denver, depending on the carrier, the route, and the operational logic of the day. The landing was smooth in the sense that smooth was the goal and frequently the outcome, and the aircraft rolled to the terminal with the practiced air of a machine that had done this many times and found it unremarkable. A jetway did not extend to meet you. You descended the mobile stairs to the tarmac, carrying your coat and your bag and the slightly altered version of yourself that several hours in a pressurized cabin had produced, and you walked into the terminal. The stopover terminal had its own character, smaller than the origin city's airport, more intimate, staffed by people who had seen this flight come through before and who managed the brief occupation of their facility by its passengers with the efficiency of a well-run train station. There was coffee. There was almost always a counter selling something. Sandwiches, newspapers, the specific category of packaged items that airports have always sold to people who didn't plan to need anything, and then found they did. There was a waiting area with seats and ashtrays, and the ambient awareness that the aircraft was being refueled outside, and that in approximately 45 minutes to an hour the process of boarding would begin again. What happened in that intermediate hour was a small, unrepeated social experiment. The group of passengers who had been sealed together for several hours in the pressurized cabin of a propeller aircraft were now dispersed across a terminal they hadn't planned to be in a city none of them had selected, with a period of time that was too short to leave and too long to simply stand. Some read, some ate. Some called home from the terminal's telephone booths, coin-operated, enclosed in glass or wood, providing the specific privacy of a public space that had been designed to give the illusion of it. Some talked to each other, continuing conversations that had begun at altitude with the easy continuity of people who had been in proximity long enough to have established a basis for conversation. The connecting passengers, the ones joining the flight at this intermediate stop, fresh from their own morning and their own terminal and their own coffee, boarded with a slightly different energy, unformed by the previous hours of shared experience, new variables in the social equation of the cabin. The through passengers who had watched them board from their seats received them with the mild territorial instincts of people who had established a prior claim on the space. The aircraft sealed itself again. The engines turned over. The mobile stairs were withdrawn. And the journey, which had paused to breathe in Kansas City or Dallas or Denver, resumed its westward intention with the equanimity of something that had done this before and expected to do it again. In the 1950s, the overlap between air travel and celebrity was significant, visible, and entirely natural, for the simple reason that the class of people who flew regularly and the class of people who were famous occupied roughly the same demographic territory. Flying required money and occasion. Fame, in the 1950s, required money and occasion. The Venn diagram had a large centre section, and that centre section spent a considerable amount of time in airport lounges and aircraft cabins, sometimes trying to be recognised and sometimes trying not to be, but always present in sufficient numbers that the famous traveller was a standard feature of the mid-century aviation landscape rather than an exceptional one. Frank Sinatra flew. This is worth stating specifically rather than generally, because Sinatra's relationship with air travel was a microcosm of the celebrity passenger experience at its most characteristic. He flew on TWA, Howard Hughes's airline, with a frequency and a comfort that reflected both his income and his taste. He was recognised. He expected to be recognised. And he handled being recognised with the specific mixture of graciousness and impatience of a man who understood that recognition was part of the transaction, and who had developed calibrated responses to its various forms. He drank on flights. He was good company. He was occasionally not good company. He was Frank Sinatra at altitude, which was essentially Frank Sinatra everywhere, the altitude being a detail rather than a transformation. Marilyn Monroe flew with a different quality of public experience. She was the most photographed woman in America in her most famous years, and her presence in an airport or an aircraft cabin generated a specific type of attention that she had learned to manage and that occasionally managed her. The airport, which in the 1950s was a small, intimate space rather than the vast anonymous infrastructure of today, offered less protective obscurity than she might have preferred. The terminal lounge, where you sat in a cushioned chair waiting for your flight, was a shared space with a social scale that meant a famous face was hard to miss and harder to politely ignore. The stewardesses, trained in discretion and professional composure, were among the better handlers of celebrity passengers that the era produced. Business executives whose names nobody knew, but whose suits cost more than your car, flew with the frequency of people for whom air travel was the baseline rather than the occasion. They were the invisible celebrities of the 1950s aircraft cabin, powerful in ways that didn't translate to recognition, uncomfortable in ways that reflected their regular use of the service, and entirely unremarkable in their presence except to each other. among whom the social calculus of who flew, how often on which airline was a form of professional status communication as legible as the suit itself. A man who flew first class weekly on a coast-to-coast route was a man with a certain kind of job, and other men with that kind of job recognised this instantly. The intimacy of the terminal meant that categories of people who would not otherwise occupy the same room did occasionally occupy the same lounge chair area, waiting for the same flight, sharing the same ashtray. The moderately prosperous traveller doing this once for a reason might find himself in a conversation with a studio executive or a senator or someone whose face he recognised from a magazine, and this conversation would happen at the natural scale of two people in a waiting room, without security or handlers or the apparatus of managed access that today separates the famous from the everyone else. This was not always comfortable for either party, but it produced occasionally the specific human connection that only proximity and shared circumstance generate, a brief, genuine exchange between two people who happened to be going to the same place at the same time, and who, in the lounge of a 1955 airport, had no particular mechanism for avoiding each other. Some of those exchanges were remembered. The altitude, the intimacy, the occasion of it, these were conditions that made things stick. When the Boeing 707 entered commercial service in the late 1950s, a portion of the travelling public reacted to it the way a portion of the public reacts to most significant technological changes, with genuine enthusiasm for the concept, comprehensive endorsement of its benefits in conversation, and a quiet, private, essentially irrational unease about actually being inside it. The jet engine was new. It was new in the way that things are new when your entire experiential reference class for the category has been something fundamentally different, new not just in degree but in kind, producing a sensory experience that shared no reliable features with what you had previously used to reassure yourself that you were fine. The propeller aircraft you had been flying for the past several years was loud, yes, and it vibrated, yes, and it flew lower and slower and stopped in gander, all of which were objective disadvantages that you had accepted as the conditions of the available technology. But they were familiar. The specific sound of 4 radial piston engines at cruise power was a sound you had heard before, had calibrated against your experience of safe arrivals, and had learned to receive as confirming evidence that the aircraft was operating as intended. You knew what it sounded like when it was right. The 707 sounded different. Higher, cleaner, more distant. And in the first weeks and months of jet service, before enough flights had accumulated in the public experience to build a new reference library of normal, that different sound occupied an uncertain category. It might be fine. It was almost certainly fine. It sounded like it was probably fine. But the absence of familiarity was its own small, persistent anxiety. The airlines understood this with the commercial intelligence of organisations that had spent the previous decade learning exactly how passenger psychology worked, and they responded with advertising campaigns calibrated to the specific nature of the concern. The message was consistent across carriers. The jet is safe. The jet is tested. The jet is better. The jet has been approved by every relevant authority and then some. TWA ran advertisements featuring the aircraft's specifications with the confidence of a manufacturer who believed that numbers were reassuring, which for a specific type of reader they were. Pan Am ran advertisements featuring the passenger experience, the smoothness, the speed, the altitude above weather, framing the jet's differences as benefits rather than unknowns, which was accurate and also strategically sound. American Airlines ran advertisements featuring the food, which was the universal solvent of aviation anxiety, and which at altitude remained excellent. The pilots managed it from the cockpit with the same technique they had always used, which was the visible application of total calm to whatever the aircraft was doing, a performance of normalcy that, because the pilots were genuinely calm, was not a performance at all but simply their authentic state. The captain who walked the cabin of a 707 in its first weeks of scheduled service and chatted with passengers about the smoothness of the ride and the improved view, and the fact that they'd be landing an hour earlier than they would have on a Constellation was providing, with complete sincerity, the most effective anxiety management available. He wasn't frightened. He found the aircraft excellent. His confidence was real, and it transferred as genuine confidence tends to the people around him who were paying attention. Within a year or two, the 707 was familiar. The sound of jet engines became the new normal, the new reference library, the new set of sounds against which normal was calibrated. Passengers who had been nervous on their first jet flight were, by their fifth, explaining to new passengers that the jet was actually much smoother than the propeller aircraft, and that the noise on takeoff was loud but brief, and that the cruise was remarkably quiet, delivering this expertise with the confidence of people who have recently acquired it and find it very usable. The fear dissolved into familiarity, which is the only cure for that particular variety of it, and which aviation has always had to wait for, and which always eventually comes. There was a moment on every 50s flight, usually shortly after a patch of rough air, occasionally at a point in the journey where the aircraft had done something that the cabin had collectively noticed and individually decided not to comment on, when a voice came over the intercom that was so specifically, deliberately, and almost architecturally calm that it operated on the nervous system with the specific effectiveness of a hand placed on a shoulder. The voice belonged to the captain. It was his voice in the sense that it was his instrument, trained, shaped by experience, and deployed with the understanding that tone was doing the work that content could not do alone. Because what the captain was saying was often quite limited, and what he was communicating was something significantly larger. The announcement was short. It did not provide technical detail. It did not explain the cause of the turbulence in the meteorological terms that would have been accurate, or the structural terms that would have been reassuring if you already trusted the structure, which most passengers sort of did and sort of didn't, in a ratio that the announcement was designed to adjust. It said something in the vicinity of, "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some light chop as we pass through a weather system. We expect smooth conditions ahead. Please keep your seatbelts fastened." That was approximately the content. The tone was the substance. The specific quality of that tone is difficult to describe precisely but instantly recognizable to anyone who has heard it, because it had a consistency across pilots and airlines and decades of commercial aviation that suggests it was either trained into people or selected for. A quality of unruffledness so complete that it communicated not merely that the speaker was unworried, but that worry, in the context of this situation, was simply not the appropriate response and never had been. The voice said, "I've seen this before. I've seen considerably more than this before. This is a known thing. We're addressing it. Please have your drink." The cultural context amplified the effect. The captain, in 1955, was a figure whose authority derived from a combination of technical expertise, military background, and the specific social weight that the era assigned to men in uniform with demonstrated competence. When he spoke, he was speaking from the cockpit, a space that passengers could not enter, that was the operational heart of the aircraft, that contained all the information about what was happening and all the means of responding to it. His voice emerging from the intercom was the cockpit communicating with the cabin, the expert addressing the non-expert, the known speaking to the uncertain. It was, in the specific social grammar of the era, authoritative in a way that required no argument. The passengers received it with visible relief that they then immediately covered with the composed expressions of people who'd not been visibly relieved a moment before, a breath released. A shoulder that had been slightly elevated returned to its neutral position. The martini that had been gripped with slightly more intention than the turbulence strictly required was set down on the tray table with the casualness of someone who had been setting drinks on tray tables all their life. The conversation that had paused, mid-syllable, resumed. The captain had spoken. The captain was calm. The captain had done this in weather far worse than this over Korea and the North Atlantic, and was not going to have any difficulty with an afternoon thunderstorm over Missouri. Everything, the voice had communicated, was fine. And because the voice was right, because it almost always was right, because the aircraft was well built and the pilot was well trained, and the weather was, in fact, manageable, the relief produced by the announcement was not misplaced. It was simply the nervous system catching up with what the available evidence, properly read, had always suggested. The approach to landing on a propeller aircraft was a sensory experience that unfolded over a considerable length of time, and involved more active participation from the aircraft than modern passengers are accustomed to receiving from theirs. It did not happen discreetly. It did not happen in the background. It happened in front of you, around you, and underneath you, in a sequence of sounds and movements and gradual revelations that began somewhere over the outer edges of the metropolitan area you were approaching, and continued, with gathering specificity, until the runway appeared below you with the sudden concreteness of something that had been theoretical until this moment, and was now clearly, definitively real. The engines changed first. The pilot reduced power for the descent, and the 4 radial engines responded by altering their note in a way that the cabin felt before it heard. A slight reduction in the frequency and intensity of the vibration, a change in the pitch of the sound that the nervous system registered as significant before the conscious mind had finished identifying why. First-time flyers tended to look up at this point, which was the correct instinct poorly timed. There was nothing to see, only the cabin ceiling. But the look upward was the body's natural response to a change that it had registered as potentially important, and about which it wanted more information than was available. Then the flaps, which produced a sound and a physical sensation that the aircraft's designers had presumably normalized in their own minds through repeated exposure, and which retained, for passengers encountering them in the descent sequence, a quality of mechanical drama that was not entirely comfortable. The aircraft's nose shifted. The angle of the seat beneath you changed in a way that made the relationship between your body and the floor feel briefly renegotiated. The window, which had been showing you cloud or open sky for the past several hours, began showing you the ground, at first as a distant abstraction of fields and roads, then as a closer and more legible landscape, then as individual farmhouses and highway intersections, and, if you were approaching a city, the specific visual vocabulary of urban density, resolving from pattern into particulars. The landing gear descended with a sound that was exactly as loud and mechanical as it needed to be to fully confirm that something significant was happening to the bottom of the aircraft, and that this something was intentional and correct, and that the correct response was to ensure your seatbelt was fastened, and your tray table was up, and your seat was in its full upright position, which the stewardess was currently confirming with a pass through the cabin that had the brisk purposefulness of a person with a checklist and a deadline. And then the runway appeared. It appeared suddenly, the way destinations appear at the end of a long journeys, all at once and closer than expected, filling the window with the flat certainty of the ground you had left several hours ago, and were now returning to at a speed that seemed, from inside the aircraft, considerably faster than it looked from outside. The wheels touched. Sometimes they touched with a smoothness that produced a brief, collective exhale of appreciation, the physical sensation of a perfect landing, which is almost no sensation at all, the aircraft simply becoming part of the Earth again with the minimum of event. Sometimes they touched in a way that suggested the aircraft and the runway had arrived at the same location with slightly different ideas about the timing. A firm and definitive contact that bounced you gently in your seat and reminded you that landing was a physical event with physical consequences, however minor. Either way, the passengers applauded every single time, because in the 1950s, a successful landing was still considered, by the people who had just participated in one, to be worth acknowledging. They were not wrong. You descended the mobile stairs back onto the tarmac, and the world received you again. The specific, outdoor, unfiltered world of the city you had flown to, with its own temperature and its own air and its own smell, which was not the recirculated, tobacco-tinged, high-altitude air of the cabin you'd been breathing for the past several hours, but something rawer and more particular and unmistakably of the ground. The descent down the stairs was the reverse of the ascent. The same mobile steps, the same tarmac, the same view of the aircraft from the outside that you'd had when you walked toward it however many hours ago, but experienced differently, because you had been somewhere in the interval, and that somewhere had changed the texture of the ordinary. You carried your coat and your bag. Your hat, if you were a man, had been retrieved from the overhead shelf and was back on your head. Your suit was the suit you had put on that morning, which felt different now, not dishevelled, because dishevelled was not the outcome that 5 hours of careful, self-conscious air travel produced, but lived in, marked by the specific experience of having been worn in a pressurised cabin where everyone smoked and the food was good, and the captain's voice had come over the intercom once to tell you something reassuring. The suit remembered the journey even if it didn't show it, and you were aware of this in the way you're aware of things that only you know. The terminal at the arrival end was smaller, in the way that arrival terminals always feel smaller than departure terminals, because departure is anticipation, and arrival is completion, and completion requires less space. You move through the arrivals hall toward baggage claim, where your luggage, tagged with that small cardboard label, loaded into the hold by ground crew whose faces you hadn't seen, carried in the belly of the aircraft through several thousand miles of air. Ye would eventually appear on a simple carousel or be brought to a counter by a porter and identified by that same tag. The wait was patient in the way that the era's waiting was patient, without the specific modern anxiety of a person watching a tracking app that has stopped updating. The people waiting for you were there, at the arrivals area, which in the 1950s was a space you could stand in without a ticket, a space where the public and the travellers met directly, rather than through the intermediary of a barrier and a security checkpoint. They had dressed for this in many cases. Coming to meet someone at the airport was an occasion, with the same social weight as seeing someone off, and it was dressed and behaved accordingly. The reunion, a handshake, an embrace, a look of recognition that contained more than recognition, and these happened in the terminal, in public, in front of strangers who were conducting their own versions of the same scene, and who understood it without needing to look. You walked out through the terminal's main doors and into the city, and you felt, even if you could not have articulated exactly why, that you had done something. Not just travelled. Travelled was the functional description, accurate and insufficient. You had participated in one of the defining experiences of the mid-century modern world. You had dressed for it and sat in it and eaten a 3-course meal during it, and gripped the armrest through the turbulence, and heard the captain's voice and applauded the landing, and descended the mobile stairs back to the earth, with your hat on and your bag in your hand. You had flown, and in 1955. That still meant something that the word itself couldn't quite contain, a residue of wonder that the experience left behind in everyone who had the occasion and the means and the specific good fortune to do it. You tucked your boarding pass into your breast pocket, not because you needed it for anything, but because it was evidence, and evidence sometimes is worth keeping. And so, here you are. You've made it through the full flight, the pressed suit, and the tarmac walk, and the 3-course meal at altitude and the martini that hit harder than expected somewhere over Oklahoma. You've sat in the wider seat and heard the captain's voice and felt the wheels touch down and added your applause to everyone else's because it was earned and you knew it was earned. And in the 1950s, that kind of honesty about what deserved acknowledgement was still available to people without embarrassment. Think about what those passengers carried with them onto those aircraft. Not just the leather bags and the good coats and the carefully selected reading material for the journey, but the specific courage of a generation that had decided collectively and without much fanfare to trust the machine, to climb the mobile stairs and sit down in the cabin and eat the meal and look out the window at the ground receding beneath them and accept, with the equanimity that the era valued above most other qualities, that this was the world now, that human beings flew, that the Atlantic could be crossed in a day, that the country could be crossed before dinner, that the impossible, given enough engineering and enough faith and enough radial piston engines running in synchrony, had a tendency to become merely extraordinary, and the extraordinary had a tendency to become routine, and routine eventually became the baseline from which the next impossible thing was attempted. They did all of this in heels and suits. They did it without seatback screens or noise-cancelling headphones, or the option of paying $14 for slightly more legroom. They did it with cotton wool earplugs against the engine noise and paper bags in the seat pocket, and the collective atmospheric contribution of 40 passengers smoking simultaneously in an enclosed space. They did it on their best behaviour, because the occasion demanded it, and because they had decided, whatever private fears they carried aboard with them, that the occasion was worth the behaviour it demanded. So tonight, as you sink into whatever comfortable horizontal surface has been waiting for you through all of this, your clean sheets, your quiet room, your bed that does not vibrate at the frequency of 4 radial piston engines and does not smell of anyone else's cigarette, maybe spare a small, genuine thought for the people who flew those early routes. The stewardess walking the aisle during turbulence with a drink on a tray and a smile that cost her something. The nervous first-time flyer in the window seat making private peace with the altitude. The captain in his 4-stripe hat, walking back to the cockpit with the unhurried certainty of a man who decided that calm was a form of kindness and practiced it accordingly. The passengers who applauded every single landing, not out of sentiment but out of honest recognition that something had been accomplished and that the people responsible deserved to know it. They flew into a future they couldn't fully see, on machines that were magnificent and loud and not entirely finished being figured out, dressed for the occasion because the occasion was real. And the future they flew into is the one you're currently lying in, quieter, faster, cheaper, and in almost every measurable way better, and carrying within it, if you know where to look, the faint residue of everything it replaced. The engines have gone quiet now. The cabin lights are dimming. Somewhere over the middle of everything, between where you started and where you're going, the ground is a long way below you and the sky is very large, and the night is doing what the night does best. Sleep well.